Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, as said, the other side of the coin, of course, for ICRP to progress in the improvement of the doctrine is to have new research results. It's essential to have good brains and good expertise in the committees, but the material, the raw material, is coming from research. And I would like to tell you this morning about the developments which are occurring in Europe in order to try and improve the productivity of research, basically. So, as mentioned before, the framework for radiation protection, which is a worldwide framework, is very sophisticated. It's one of the most sophisticated as risk management systems for all over the risks which the human species has to confront, and it is efficient in daily terms. But, of course, we still have uncertainties, and some of them were mentioned by Werner earlier. And some of these uncertainties results from the fact that not only experts necessarily don't agree, but there are knowledge gaps, particularly in the field of radiobiology. Also, radiation protection is a practical skill which has to be implemented by doctors. We had a question before, by nuclear industry, and on the other side by regulators who have to control a licensing system. And for that, you don't only need principles, you need the toolbox, models, calculation systems, etc., or in hospital systems to calculate the dose, etc. So this toolbox can always be improved, and there are areas where it should be improved, but that requires also new knowledge. Another element is that as time goes on, new generations of experts arrive or should arrive, and the training and education of experts in this highly specialized area, especially in countries where nuclear power is going down, it's maybe not so attractive for new generations to study these matters. So the issue of education and training is actually in Europe a foremost preoccupation for many institutions. And of course, you don't do research without infrastructures, and funding and maintaining infrastructures and improving them where needed is also something which is not trivial. So, for example, we have remaining targets such as individual sensitivity, for which we don't know. We know it exists. We don't know what the reasons are in detail, and we don't have any biomarkers to predict. So the whole radiation protection system is based on the average person, which is nice to make radiation protection policy. When you're a doctor in front of a patient, it's less useful because you can't go further, you can't derive reasoning for one person. And this is extremely difficult to explain to a mother for her child, for example. So that's something which actually is a very big field where progress would be very useful for radiation protection. But, and I would say also post-accidental metalling, just to give another example. These are very complex issues which haven't been cracked now because the research is fragmented. So the hope is that, at least in Europe, but we seek more worldwide also, is the pooling of resources. That means that different teams actually work to the same strategies, pooling of resources in terms of scientific, but also in terms of funding projects, the administration of research, and for periods of time which is over decades. And of course, you require to solve these problems a shared scientific strategy and an efficient budget allocation system. Of course, that's the consequence of the pooling of resource, but it's got to be well administered in order to encourage multidisciplinarity, without which there won't be a solution, and avoid dispersion of effort and discontinuity in the progression. For example, if you create biomarkers, but they can't be validated because they've been set up by one team, another team has to validate them or to see if they are reproducible. And sometimes people who fund research forget about these things, and then it drops out. So where are we today? After about 8 years of this new launch of this policy integration, which started in 2008 with the work of the high-level, so-called high-level group in Europe, well, we have 5 platforms. They were presented briefly yesterday. They are actually quite successful in gathering in Europe in a wide sense, not only EU, the scientific communities across the disciplines. So the platforms are not lobbies for disciplines. They are trying to be, each within their scope, attract multidisciplinarity in order to engage into meaningful dialogue. What do the platforms do? They actually write and develop and maintain strategic research agendas, which are kind of organized listing of priority research with the reasoning behind why this research is needed. They also combine the cooperation with the competition. That means when researchers meet in the platforms to discuss common strategies, they're working together, but they're also aware that they will compete in the calls. And it's not easy to do that, to share with your competitors your own thoughts about the best way to approach problems. But it's progressing, and it's essential, at least in Europe, a small continent, in order to actually produce results. We need both the competition for scientific excellence, and we need the co-working of people, and it's working, and that's nice to see. We need, of course, policies and action plans for infrastructures and training and education. There's an ongoing activity. You need to fund university courses. You need to maintain platforms and to develop access to platforms which are, scientific platforms which are pretty unique in Europe sometimes. And of course, we need ambitious research projects. And there are some now. We just quote, for example, the MEDIRAD project, which was launched this year, where one of the objectives is to try and develop biomarkers that would predict the possibility or the higher probability of occurring of cardiovascular damage in women after breast radiotherapy. This is actually very innovative research, and if it's successful, it will be for the clinicians actually, and for the dialogue with the patient and the justification of the radiotherapy and maybe the improvement of radiotherapy protocols, essential piece of work. But it's a project of research, and we shall see. And of course, we are developing together with all the platforms a joint roadmap. I'll come back to that in a minute. So this concept of integration of research in Europe is in fact based on two combined approaches. On one hand, we have the platforms, so each have their scope, but there is overlaps, of course, so we have a common memorandum of understanding. We meet together to adjust, and of course a lot of institutions are members of more than one platforms through different experts and researchers. So this is a nice ensemble which works quite smoothly. And of course, to do research you need the money, and the understanding with the European Commission and the EURATOM member states is that these platforms are just on intellectual platforms. They are self-sufficient, they've got their own membership fees, etc. They don't do research, so they're not exposed to high costs, apart from their meetings, and the costs come from the research itself, and this is funded by EURATOM and the member states in Europe, and they come under these projects which actually are committed to support integration. That means all these projects which are listed here are actually based, the calls or the contents of the projects rely on the strategic research agendas of the platforms. And as you see, as the years have gone past, they are in succession of time, the scope of these projects has gone wider as the platforms have been able to develop their own strategic research agendas. And the latest one, the green one, is not yet open. This call will be open, will be published at the end of this month, and I can confirm today on behalf of the European Commission that there will be an information day for researchers on the 9th of November in Brussels, where the European Commission will present the call, which is not only radiation protection, but part of it is radiation protection, and the following day, on the 10th, tomorrow, with our colleague of the other platforms, we are going to discuss the organization of an info day for the researchers in more detail, which will be organized jointly by the platforms also in Brussels on the 10th of November. So you will hear that from that later, and for the Commission Day, if you need details, you can talk to André Jouvre here in the room. So the roadmap, which is a subject of preoccupation at the moment, and it's a deliverable from the project concept. We have to provide a detailed roadmap by 2019 for the whole radiation protection field in Europe. What are we talking about? We have at the moment strategic research agendas here in red in the middle, so that means what are the research priorities? These documents exist and they are quite interesting and nice, and they have evolved over the years. These have been mainly developed by the research community. The roadmap is a broader concept where we feel it's important to have a policy relation with the stakeholders, regulators, industry, associations, etc. We need to understand why we do this research in terms that they can understand and relates to their concerns, not just the researchers' concerns that there is an ambiguity or a lack of knowledge. The doctors, you see, you had the question here earlier was clearly an illustration of that. We need that relation, and of course we need money. We need money for a long time. We need money which is going to be spent in a clever way, and so we need to involve the governments and EURATOM and the European Commission, because they have the key to how much. We can't decide that for them. We can suggest, but parliaments vote, etc. And the roadmap is actually no longer what are the priorities, but what are the research strategies that will, of course, allow the SRAs to be developed, but also the research strategies that are actually understandable by society. Where are we going? What are our promises over the medium term? And of course, what would be the budgets? Because then from that size, research institutions can plan their operations better and say in a safer way. So in short, the joint roadmap will provide an understandable link between societal concerns with ionizing radiation exposure and science and research. I'll give you an example later. It will also provide medium-term consensus-based research strategy to achieve in a credible way the priorities of the platform's SRAs. And of course it's an element of justification for a stable medium-term funding system which has to compete with other funding priorities in Europe and elsewhere, I guess. So just briefly, two examples. There is not much time left. This is a complicated slide, but it's just to show that in the field of radiobiology, there is a need for a strategy to address not only the top, which is quite well understood, the DNA damage and the stochastic effects. This has been known for some time, but the influence of the response systems, of the homeostasis of the body, which is linked to individual performance, genetic, epigenetic, and also other sources of stress at the time of irradiation or exposure. This is actually not clearly understood, and it's very complicated, and no single team can address that alone. So only through a collective effort can we actually try to find pathways to address this. Another one is when you talk about the toolbox for radiation protection, when you have post-accident situations, you need to have optimization. And of course you can optimize by saying, well, my objective is 1 millisievert, but we know this is actually maybe not necessarily the optimum, because the wider the evacuation, the higher the health impact of the evacuation itself. This was presented quite nicely yesterday in a session, is increasing with the population affected. So there is an optimum somewhere, but you can't actually address it unless you have proper radiobiology, understanding the effects, dosimetry, because you need precise figures of actual doses, not just calculated doses, because you have the time, you're in a post-accident situation, and you need social scientists and of course informatics in order to model the optimum. And today this toolbox does not exist, so any government confronted to a post-accident crisis has to struggle with the existing thresholds, 1, 5, 20 millisieverts, and it's extremely difficult and frustrating. But research will help. So what are the next steps? Well, we will have scientific workshops in order to explore the potentialities of these research topics. We are planning to have a Joint Platform Technical Secretariat, to have some permanent staff lent by the different member bodies in order to better organize future research. We are looking for the 9th framework program to have a nice financial and strategic fitting, which I call here a European Joint Program. This is a co-funded European Commission plus member states with taking into account the lessons of concept, which is running until 2020. And also we are looking towards a more organized international cooperation mechanisms, because these developments do not occur in Europe alone. MELODI is going to co-fund a seminar on individual radiation sensitivity, where we will try and attract the best 30 to 40 experts worldwide to try and help develop that part of the roadmap. And this will be followed by a consensus deliverable, which then will be discussed and included in the roadmap. And finally, as a word of conclusion, we have once more a radiation protection system which is fine, which works for most planned exposures, and in those areas it has good to very good performance. But this system can still break down, and we had this issue in Japan. It can break down in public opinion on issues related to low dose rate risks affecting large populations or ecosystems. The use of radiation in medical sphere could even become even safer and more effective with better understanding of the phenomena which are associated to to exposure to radiation. But of course, as I've tried to explain, progress requires sustained research efforts policies that will give science maximum chance to resolve complex and difficult problems worldwide. Thank you very much.